The philosophers point out that there are two sources of failure in anything we set out to do as human beings. One is ignorance. Knowledge has not always existed, and science has only filled in the gaps. Hasn't filled in all the gaps, to say the least. And so we have failures because we just don't know what the best thing to do is. But then the second source of failure they call ineptitude, meaning the knowledge exists, but an individual or a group of individuals failed to apply it correctly. What I think is different about our time is that we've reached the precipice of a shift in the kinds of failures we are up against. For most of human history, our major problem was grappling with ignorance. We didn't know the illnesses that faced us or what to do about them, and we didn't know enough about the natural world to understand what our ways were of best manipulating it and using it to our advantage. But arrive at the end of the 20th century, where we are today, and we've accumulated huge volumes of knowledge about what we are capable of. But we have an enormously hard time delivering on it. It's hard not to be angry if your own family member dies from an infection they picked up in a hospital because somebody didn't wash their hands. There's a reason philosophers gave it such a pitiless name, ineptitude. It's what we feel about it. Now, I never thought I would be writing a book of all things about checklists as a surgeon. But I was assigned a project with the World Health Organization to try to find a way to reduce deaths in surgery. In the United States, we do about 50 million operations a year. We've gotten really good at doing them. Our expertise has grown. But you have to do them really well when you're doing that many to avoid having an occasional error that's damaging. And when our complication rates in hospitals are around 3%, it has meant that we have over 500,000 people left severely disabled each year following surgery, and about 150,000 people who die, 3 to 4 times as many as after car accidents. If we thought, well, this is just the natural risk of surgery, then what you do is invest in more research to discover new ways of handling surgery. But our studies have shown us that at least half of these deaths and major complications are avoidable with knowledge that already exists, with standards of care that people could have followed through on but didn't. And the puzzle is then what to do about it. Our major tactics when faced with handling that kind of complexity has been specialization. And yet, still, those statistics I told you are persisting. So what we did in this project with the WHO was start looking to other fields and ask how they've handled complexity when it has become extreme. We looked at the aviation world, for example, and as planes have become more complicated, what they have done to make it so that pilots are able to manage situations better, not worse. We looked at the skyscraper building world, where the proliferation of super specialties in that world, people who design elevators in particular ways, who also have to work with the environmental team, and yet their rate of major structural failures and safety problems have declined over time despite their increase in ambition. And when we looked at what they had in common about what they were doing, I expected to find it was different ways of training people or different kinds of technology, and instead found it was checklists, the kind of lowest tech tool you could imagine turning to. Well, we stole their ideas and decided that although it isn't something we naturally think of in a field like surgery, that maybe we would try a checklist. We worked with Boeing because they taught us that there are checklists that help and checklists that hurt, and that there is knowledge that has to be accumulated about how they do that. And multiple steps along the way, ranging from making sure you've identified a pause point. A checklist is not a theoretical tool, it is a practical tool, and you have to find a moment when a team can actually stop for 60 seconds and employ the checklist, pull it out and actually use it. We identified that there is a pause point before anesthesia is given, when we could ask a team to make a series of checks, before an incision, and then before the patient leaves the room. They also teach us to keep it incredibly tight. A long checklist becomes a distraction, something that is just annoying as hell to use, and also impractical to use because it begins distracting you from the task that's also going on simultaneously. And so you have to chunk it, you have to break it down into small sections. You also have to be disciplined about picking out what they call the killer items, those most critical steps that could fail and that the brain can fail to remember. One of the fascinating group that took away some ideas from this were in the investment world. There's a tiny group of investment fund and hedge fund managers who have been seeing the recurrent cycle of bad investment mistakes. And you know, maybe it's hubris, but decided to tackle what they are calling checklist investment, meaning not that you can follow a formula for how to invest, but that there are patterns of recurrent failures in what we do in the investment world. So, for example, recurrently making mistakes in identifying the amount of debt that companies have, misreading financial reports. Everything that people needed to know about Enron being a failure and a bad investment was available in their financial reports. And so what they've done is they've studied all the past mistakes and then boiled it down into checklists that are incorporated into key moments of the investment process. I describe one investor, for example, who on the third day of looking at a potential investment has a series of checks. And by that point, they should have looked at all of the financial statements of the company for the past 10 years. And they have specific checks for certain items, like the footnotes on the cash flow statements, a place where companies often would hide information about their most vulnerable concerns. They legally have to disclose it, but they find that that's a place to put it. Time and again, they found that when they were looking at investments and had made major mistakes, they hadn't checked on these things. Somebody had skipped it. You know, you have all of these different places that you try to hold in your head as an investor. So this time they turned it into a checklist process. And they found that they've caught numerous mistakes along the way, kept them from happening, improved their results, and gotten them into place. The principle behind being able to make it a daily part of what they did is almost a philosophical point of view. It's recognizing that no matter how good you are, you're going to fail. You will not do what you say you intend to do. The world has become too complex to hold it all in your brain. And so based on where you failed before and where you think you might fail in the future, you make a series of checks. You find a moment when it actually is feasible to make those checks. And then you incorporate them into what you do. If they're done well, they can make even experts be enormously better.